In this season of longer nights and shorter daylight, our theme for the month we chose here in Riverdale Yonkers is stillness. And we also want to remember that this is Human Rights Month. Human Rights Day was 3 days ago, December 10th, the anniversary of the adoption of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly. And December 15th, this coming Tuesday, is Bill of Rights Day in the United States, the anniversary of the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution in 1791, which guarantee a lot of basic human rights like the right to one's own religion, the right to speak of freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Quoting UN Women Executive Director Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, she's the first woman deputy president of South Africa as well. She said, "Our hopes for a more just, safe, and peaceful world can only be achieved when there is universal respect for the inherent dignity and equal rights of all members of the human family." As we at Riverdale Yonkers symbolize by putting the Human Rights Declaration and the Bill of Rights on the wall of our meeting room in our physical building, respect for human rights and human dignity are essential to the ethical life. Last week, I talked about the personal side of letting go to move on. And so today, I'm actually kind of talking about how does letting go or stillness apply to the social justice side of our ethical lives. I can't help here but see that idea of letting go from both the personal side and the social justice side. A lot of talk after the election about let's have unity. I think we've all heard that. What does it mean? Well, say some, we have had a divided nation. Time to put it back together. Stop talking about different political ideologies. Just be one happy family. Come back together. Well, I have a problem with the phrasing there. Put it back together. Come back together. It was not together in the first place, never was. We were never all one happy family. We were divided and have been. We have division in this nation as long as there is racism, as long as there is not justice for Indigenous Americans, as long as there is sexism, homophobia, anti Semitism, Islamophobia. Those are divisions. To think we can be back together while those exist is to decide that we only includes white, straight, Christian men. In the very direct and clear words of Robert Jones Jr., who goes by the name Son of Baldwin in his internet presence, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. My mind has been going a lot after this election back to 1983. Harold Washington had just been elected mayor, supported by a multiracial coalition of progressives, the first Black mayor of Chicago. There's a lot of resonance for me to recent national elections, including a huge effort that year that registered 100,000 new voters in the city, many of them Hispanic or Black, many of them younger voters. Washington came into office after a primary where he got only 37% of the vote. The incumbent Jane Byrne got 33% of the vote, and Richard M. Daley, son of the recently deceased Mayor Richard J. Daley, also ran in that primary and got 30%. If Byrne and Daley had not split the mostly white vote, if only one of them had run, Washington could not have won that primary. In Chicago in those days, in the mayoral primary, a white progressive Democrat would often challenge the regular Democrat in the primary and lose very big. Whoever won the Democratic primary for mayor usually then got 75 to 80% of the vote in the general election. But Harold Washington was not a candidate supported by the white regular Democrats. And so many of the white regular Democrats joined with the Republicans after the primary and supported Bernie Epton in what was a nasty and divisive campaign, which again resonates for me in recent years. Washington, with the active support of that multiracial progressive coalition, defeated Epton 51.7% to 48%. Very familiar percentage difference, very similar to our popular vote in this election. Well, after Harold Washington won that election, there came a period that we in Chicago in those days called Council Wars, named for the movie Star Wars, which was then pretty recent. The progressive white aldermen, all the women on the council, and the black aldermen on the city council all supported Washington. They numbered 21 of the city councilmen. The other 29 aldermen, of which only one, if I remember right, was a Republican before that time, the other 29 against 21 came together to oppose Washington, again, often viciously. I worked then with many who voted against and opposed Washington. They were in my workplace. They were scared and said so explicitly that now that there was a black mayor, it meant that white neighborhoods would no longer get city services, as everyone knew was the case under the past white mayors, where black neighborhoods didn't get many services. At about that time, Chicago was found to be one of the top 3 racially segregated cities in the country. And so, yes, there were very racially divided neighborhoods. Well, Harold Washington didn't and couldn't unify with his opposition in the sense of agree with them, even if he had wanted to. They tried to kill just about all of his decisions and appointments, though they had just one vote short of overriding his vetoes. So there was, for most votes, a standstill. But Washington could decide to be a mayor anyway to the whole city. And that is what he did. I remember one of his first initiatives after he took office was to fix traffic lights throughout the city. Now, we don't think of traffic lights as a big human rights issue, but they were certainly a public safety issue. In those days, I drove through a number of different Chicago neighborhoods on my way to work, many of them represented by white progressive aldermen and others represented by the white regular aldermen. Under the previous mayor, there had been serious neglect throughout the city, through much more of the black neighborhoods, of traffic lights. Citywide, about 10% of the traffic lights in the city didn't work when Harold Washington took office. It was that bad. And so one of his first acts was to order every traffic light throughout the city repaired. Well, my coworkers who had been so scared of Washington were astonished. They had not expected that their traffic lights would be fixed under Washington. He also managed to get through a number of other initiatives that served the whole city. He established the first city environmental affairs department. Crime rates declined during his term, though his opponents claim they rose. And so when there were special elections for some of the alderman seats a couple years later, Washington allies won enough of those that this council moved to a 25-25 tie, with Washington finally able to break the tie. And Washington won his second term, although even with that narrow margin, with the ability of the tiebreaker, there was a vicious and often racist campaign against him. In the context of today's topic, creating a space for justice, Washington was able to let go of the kind of division which said that whatever faction was in charge as mayor only served their own supporters. He was able to create space for that vision of justice, a vision of justice for all, dignity and rights for all. Those white ethnic voters who were also among the economically disadvantaged found themselves better off than they had been under white mayors. Well, my son went at the time of Washington's term to a school in Chicago that encouraged learning about politics. Each grade had a debate every election where students would represent the candidates who were running. My son, I'm proud to say, in first grade picked Harold Washington. Well, he could hardly do otherwise since his father and I were working hard on the campaign. But he was the only white student in his class to come out as pro Washington. I'm very proud that he stood his ground on that, and his teacher and the heads of the school encouraged his courage and conviction against the opposition, even of the other students. Well, a couple of years into Washington's term, one of the challenges that the city faced was the erosion of the shoreline, the serious erosion along Lake Michigan. My son's school was only a couple of buildings away from that shoreline. Washington led an initiative to, well, shore up the shoreline, keep it from eroding dangerously. And he, with a couple of politicians who were supporting him, came to the area where my son's school was for a photo op when that project was completed in that area. Well, the heads of the school saw the photo op happening outside and went out and asked if they could have a photo of the school kids with the mayor. Well, sure. And there is one of them. As they aligned the students, the head of the school pushed my son to the front and introduced him to the mayor and told him that my son had been the only one in his class to support him and had stood up against that opposition. And yes, that is my son there shaking hands with the mayor. Another version of that picture with my son back in the crowd became Washington's major campaign literature picture for the next election. Well, Washington talked to the kids a bit. He really loved children. And when the next class debate took place, when Washington ran for a second term, almost all of the kids in the class supported him. Many of their parents had changed their minds, and so had the kids, especially after having met him. So making space for justice doesn't mean forgetting injustice and hurt, but it does mean deciding that the past isn't going to be different than it was. And it also means not being so attached to that wrongness that you can't move forward in the right way. It does mean creating that space for justice. Some of you know that one of my annual events for a few years has been a conference that I go to on building inclusive and anti-racist congregations. Most years it's been held here in New York. This year, I've been actively encouraging people within ethical societies to join in April 2021 with that conference, since it will be much more affordable and fully virtual. Well, a week ago yesterday, I woke up to the terrible news that the church in the East Village, where this conference had been held, the historic building that had held such love and vision, had been destroyed by a fire. My heart goes out to that community, and I expressed my feelings to the Reverend Jackie Lewis, no relation, who has led that beacon of justice and inclusion in New York City. And I was also reminded of her words right after the recent election, as reported in the progressive religious journal Sojourners. Words that I resonated with, and many here I hope can too. This is a quote from that article. Reverend Jackie Lewis of New York's Middle Collegiate Church declared that the Sunday after the election was a day of celebration. She said, "I'm going to celebrate that when George Floyd cried out for his mama, mamas answered," she preached. Of course, the article goes on, not all mothers answered. Lewis acknowledged the pain of knowing that millions of people voted for 4 more years of Donald Trump. She said, "Though we are rejoicing today and I am partying with the best of us, we're just not finished. We're not finished until we understand that we are really, actually inextricably connected one to the other. That when a child in Appalachia is hungry, my stomach growls. That when a child in Detroit still doesn't have clean water to drink, you're thirsty. That when a queer couple is harassed just for being in love with one another, that all of us feel heartbroken. That's the end of the quote from the article. And I think that really is what unity after the election would look like, real unity. Care for everyone, care for the poor, the disadvantaged in our society, making their situations better no matter who they voted for, making their lives really better instead of letting them continue to buy into myths that white working class men suffer because of Black people and immigrants threatening to take their jobs. You know, that's what polls in 2016 said was the best best prediction um, of who would vote for the current White House resident was they believed that Black people and immigrants were after their jobs. And for many people here in our group who have worked hard for 4 years to resist some of the programs of that resident of the White House and his supporters, creating space for justice, I hope can mean we can let go of being in resistance mode all the time without feeling guilty for taking a rest. Creating space for justice means we need to be in that neutral zone for a bit that I talked about last week. Figure out what we need to do going forward, still committed to the deep values of compassion and reason and inclusion. It does not mean we let go of those values. It means we create space for a new kind of inclusive love and justice. Justice, as Cornel West has pointed out, is what love looks like in public. And just as we can continue to love a family member, even if they hold different beliefs than we do, without giving up our own convictions, we can create space for the kind of justice that benefits everyone who is in need without giving up our own values. A real unity is the kind of unity that Harold Washington built when he decided to be a governor to all the city, not just a part of it. It is one kind of unity that truly serves everyone. I mean, you who are here listening may have different names for what that means. To me, it means that poverty is a human rights issue. In this nation, there is no excuse for anyone to be poor, to struggle to feed or house themselves or their children. In this world, there's no excuse. It means ending racism, xenophobia, sexism, anti Semitism, and Islamophobia so that wealth and political representation is not distributed disproportionately by your identity. It means recognizing that white Appalachians and many working class and poor white men struggle a lot more than they did 50 years ago to make a living. And Black and Native Appalachians and working and poor men and women of all identities and locations continue to struggle as well. It means recognizing that climate change is a human rights issue, that those who are most disadvantaged economically and socially in our world are already bearing the greatest burden of climate change. We have to shift and change away from fossil fuels for our energy, for instance, and we have to find ways to use energy less and more efficiently when we do use it. And we have to recognize that there are people whose livelihoods have been eked out in jobs related to the obsolete energy sources. And justice also means everyone has a right to the basics of life, which means we need to provide alternative work and support during a transition period to a different economy, even while as a larger society we let go of and move on from those dangerous and obsolete industries. We need to let go of those industries, but not the people. A basic principle of ethics, I think, is expressed in this quote from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I'll say that again. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So that is our opportunity always when we talk about social justice. Too often in social justice work, as in personal life, we rush to fill that space between the old and the new. And then we respond rather than choosing a response. That is when we can act out of our rage, our depression, our urge for revenge. Now, I've talked often about how basic neuroscience tells us that when we are reacting and not taking the space to get to a calmer space, the part of our brain that can process complex information and find a more logical and reasonable, practical response is actually suppressed. It's turned off. When we are afraid, when we are depressed, when we are enraged, the part of our brain that recognizes others as human beings is literally also being suppressed. Our compassion and our reason are both suppressed when we react. We may, in that reactive state, react in ways that are not in harmony with our commitment to the human rights and dignity of all. We may, rather than transcend the oppressions that we are reacting against, simply repeat the cycle. We need to create space for justice. Justice is not a reaction. Going along with the status quo for the sake of not having conflict is another reaction that is based in fear. To create space for justice, not just the appearance of unity, is what we need, but we have to look underneath to the real divisions. We have to create space. When we create that space, we can acknowledge the conflicts that are real and face them with a kind of compassionate and just solutions that undermine those real divisions between us. Justice is the unifier, not denial of difference. Tricia Hersey, founder of a project she called the NAP Ministry, says that she claimed the year 2020 as the year of grief, the year of rest. She wrote recently, I am sick of rushing and the obsession with opening back up and getting back to normal. I never want to see normal or the way it was again. It is a time for a new way. Rest and slowing down will be the foundation for a liberated future that many are screaming about online via memes, in the streets during the uprising for Black lives, and in our hearts. We are not well. We are exhausted and disgusted. It has always been time for justice. It has always been time to rest. Rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. This is our main tenet since we started researching our Rest is Resistance framework back in 2013. Whoops. I do recommend that you check out and do a Google search for NAP Ministry, especially if you are someone who, in their wanting to make the world better, feels just tired right now of the emails, the social media, the phone calls, the protests, and yet nevertheless gets caught up in them. We are all in a kind of neutral zone as a society. The past is not yet gone. The future is not yet here. We're in a neutral zone between. The future is not going to be perfect or easy either. Just as personally we are never really the same after a loss, we won't be the same as a society after this pandemic, after this shift in who matters in our nation. Our cycle of the year here at the Society for Ethical Culture has this month with a theme of stillness. And January, we selected a theme of imagination, and then February to look at the theme of beloved community. I'm really glad that we chose those themes in that order last March, when it was really hard to see what was ahead, because I think they fit well and build on each other as we go through this period of change. This month is stillness, taking that time between, remembering that it's always needed to have some stillness, not just in December. And next month, imagining what could be a different future if we are not just to repeat the past. And in February, beloved community, how can we build a world that is really inclusive, in which those who have disagreed can talk with and respect one another? Can we talk with those in our own circles whose actions we find violate our own basic values? Can we find a way to love and respect them as human beings enough to talk to them, to give them an opportunity to hear us, maybe to change their minds? None of us knew all our lives what we know now. Well, you will see on our calendar at ricex.org some new opportunities in the new year after this rest time to come together other than on Sundays and experiment with resting and imagining in coordination with the rhythm of nature, with a gathering to reflect together at the new moon in January. A refocus on some basic values of our ethical movement in a one evening session on the ideas behind our movement, and a month long opportunity that I'm really excited about to reflect on how we can better talk with those people in our lives who might not accept that racism is a significant problem in today's world. And the statistics recently said that in America, 55% of white people do not believe that racism is a significant problem. Well, I hope that after your rest of this month, you'll emerge and respond by participating in one or more of those activities. For now, though, it is a time of stillness and between, time to recharge however we are able to do that. Some have that time imposed on us with illness and injury. All of us have some imposition of it with this pandemic. And add to that winter when it becomes generally a bit harder to get out and about. So I invite you for the rest of this month to think of it as a time of rest and recharging, a time between stimulus and response, a time to create the space for a more just, compassionate, peaceful world in which human rights and human dignity for all can bloom.